All right, good day, everyone. So the purpose of this presentation is to provide a brief overview of my dissertation to my expert panel. So as part of my doctoral dissertation here at Dakota State University, I'm working on developing what I'm calling an outcome-based approach to cybersecurity assurance. Just quickly, my dissertation committee here at DSU includes Dr. Ahmed Al-Hamouri, who's the chair, and then Dr. Kyle Cronin, who's the co-chair, and also Professor Scott Mostad, who's a member of the committee. With that, I'll jump into my presentation. So here's my agenda for this presentation. I'll start by providing a quick personal introduction of myself, and then I'll introduce the research problem and then build some context around that. Then I'll discuss the gaps I've found in the literature review that I've conducted regarding cybersecurity assurance approaches, and particularly the gaps in the compliance-based and risk-based approaches. And then finally, I'll describe the new approach that I'm developing, which I'm calling the outcome-based approach to cybersecurity assurance. All right, so quick personal introduction. I am Yusuf Muhammad. I'm originally from India. I've been living in the US for about 15 years now. In terms of my educational qualifications, I'm a doctoral candidate here at Dakota State University in the cyber defense program. And prior to this, I'd completed my master's in cyber defense also at DSU. And other than that, I have an MBA from University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and a master's degree in MIS from Florida International University. Now, in terms of my professional experience, I've been in the industry for over 18 years now, starting in IT operations, doing a little bit of system administration, database administration, and then switching to cybersecurity. And I've spent over a decade in the security governance, risk, and compliance space in multiple roles. And I currently manage security assurance for a large tech company based out of San Francisco Bay Area here in California. So that's a little bit about me. Uh, so with that, I'll jump into the next part, which is uh, introducing the problem that I'm solving and the research context. So I want to start with some numbers to sort of set the context. So first up, we have some numbers on incidents. Now, last year, in 2024, that is, there were over 30,000 cybersecurity incidents and over uh, 10,000 confirmed breaches, as published in the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report from 2024. And this apparently marks a 10% increase over the year before. Now, there's more bad news for those organizations that suffered a data breach because the cost of data breaches last year was 4.8 million USD on average, and globally, uh, and 9.36 million here in the US. Now, people usually stop at these numbers because they're good enough to grab attention. And frankly, if you've been in the industry even for a bit, the numbers should look familiar to you. Like, you shouldn't be surprised because the number of incidents and the cost of data breaches has been growing constantly over the last several years. But I want to take this one step further, though. I want to draw your attention to these next set of numbers, which are from the expense side of things, if you will. So, according to one estimate, companies across the world have spent approximately $214 billion in 2024 on security. And here in the US, the number stands at approximately 25 billion. Now, additionally, on average, organizations here in the US spent about 5.7 million on cybersecurity in 2024. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is that, cybersecurity threats have been growing, but in response to the growing threats, organizations have been investing a lot of money in cybersecurity. Now, sometimes it may have been in good faith to protect their customers' data and to improve their resilience, etc. But at other times, their hands may have been forced because they may be forced to comply with a variety of global, federal, and local regulations and industry standards, etc. Right. So depending on the industry they operate in, the type of data, the store or process, or the geography the organization operates in, there could be in scope for a variety of security and privacy related regulations. So, for example, here in the US, if you're in the healthcare organization or work in the healthcare space, you're required to comply with something called HIPAA. And if you're in the financial industry, you need to comply with something called the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, or GLBA for short, which essentially enforces a bunch of security requirements. And then internationally, there's the world famous EU GDPR, right? That's enforced on all companies that have a presence in the EU or serve EU-based customers, etc. And then there are industry standards such as, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, PCI DSS for short, which you need to comply with if you store or process credit card data, etc. Right? Now, given the fact that organizations are spending millions of dollars on cybersecurity every year, investing in the latest technology such as your next generation firewalls, right? Your IDS, IPS, or AI powered IDS, IPS now, or SIMs or EDR, NDR, the whole alphabet soup, right? And not only that, but on top of that, organizations are designing and implementing these rigorous security processes such as change management, configuration management, your incident response, business continuity, your BCPDR, etc. Right? Now, these can be sometimes be really complex, but as an organization, when I'm doing all of these things, a key question to ask, if I'm in management, is how do I get confidence or assurance that all these security solutions and all these rigorous processes that I'm implementing are doing what they're supposed to do, right? Now, for an organization that's looking for a comprehensive uh, option, if you will, to gain assurance over not only its security posture, but also all the technical security solutions and the security processes it has implemented, etc. The traditional solution has been to take what's a what's called a compliance-based approach, right? And so essentially, you hire an auditor who can come in and test your controls and then tell you if they're good or bad, right? But you know this approach is not best suited for gaining assurance, as I'll uh, discuss later. But the other thing is, the general sentiment in the industry is that achieving or demonstrating compliance doesn't necessarily translate to good security, right? I mean, you could comply with the most stringent of the regulations out there and still get hacked, right? And it's not a hypothetical scenario anymore, right? It's happened in the past where companies that were fully compliant with your PCI DSS, which is considered to be one of the most stringent security standards out there. So companies that have been fully PCI DSS compliant have had their customers' credit card data stolen, and then there's just numerous cases of hospitals or healthcare organizations here in the US getting compromised despite being fully compliant with HIPAA security requirements, right? So the point I'm trying to make is that compliance-based approach is good at telling you whether or not your controls comply with specific requirements, but it's not effective in terms of providing general assurance of security. And as I'll discuss later, outside of the compliance-based approach, there are really no comprehensive options that can be used to gain assurance at an organizational level. And that is essentially the problem that I'm trying to solve. So as part of my dissertation, I'm planning on developing a novel approach to cybersecurity assurance, which I'm calling an outcome-based approach. And the idea is to shift the focus from compliance to outcomes that controls are intended to achieve for the organization. So at a high level, instead of testing for whether or not a control exists or if it meets certain requirements, we think about what the control is supposed to achieve and then test for whether or not it achieves that. All right. So with that, I'll move on to, uh, you know, the results of the literature review that I've conducted as part of my dissertation study so far. So to summarize the gap that I've found in literature for an organization or for anyone looking for a comprehensive approach to gain assurance over their organizational security controls holistically, that is just beyond technical assessments, they have, broadly speaking, two options. One is they can take a compliance-based approach and use the typical audit methods from the accounting or financial auditing discipline, and test the controls for compliance, right? So as most of you are probably aware, these controls are borrowed from the auditing industry, the financial auditing industry in particular. That's where your big fours and your CPA firms come in. But the focus of the testing or controls assessment would be whether or not controls meet specific requirements, as opposed to outcomes the controls are supposed to achieve, or the value the controls are supposed to provide to the organization. So as an example, let's say the auditors are testing your controls related to anti-malware. Now, the focus of such testing would be on determining whether or not an anti-malware system is installed, whether it's enabled on a system, and then whether or not the anti-malware system is receiving, signature updates in a timely manner. But that would be the extent of testing, right? In my career of over 15 years in the industry, I've never seen an auditor test the anti-malware controls to see whether or not they're actually protecting systems against malware. So, that's just not how auditing works. And then, to give you more examples on controls testing, uh, let's say the auditors are testing for change management, right? The typical audit would, they would ask for you, they would ask for a sample of changes, and then within the sample for each change, they'll look to see whether or not the change was approved, whether or not it was tested, etc. But that would be the extent of it, right? There's never a question of what it is that change management is supposed to achieve, and whether or not the controls that are in place are achieving that, right? Now, just to clarify, I didn't mean to talk less of the financial auditing discipline, or the auditing methods in general. I mean, I don't see this as a failure of the auditing discipline. It's just that the auditing discipline and the auditing techniques and the methods that were built for a specific purpose, which is to measure compliance. But beyond that, they have a very limited use, in my opinion. All right, so moving on, the second option for assurance that is commonly used is what I call the risk-based approach. Now, in this approach, organizations typically start by conducting a risk assessment to understand and evaluate the risks facing the organization. And the idea is to evaluate specific risk scenarios in terms of their likelihood of occurrence, and the potential impact to the organization should the event materialize, right? And as you may have seen, this is typically done by assigning subjective scores to risk scenarios, such as high, medium, low. But then the industry is moving towards a more quantitative risk assessments, where you estimate potential dollar value for each loss scenario, etc. Right? But once the risks are evaluated, you sit down and decide, you know, whether you want to mitigate the risk, and then select and implement controls to mitigate against those specific scenarios. And then you continuously monitor the risk and reevaluate the risk in a cyclic manner, right? Now, typically in this approach, there's no specific test or a step for control testing or control evaluation. Although some organizations use the same auditing methods or techniques to test controls, and some organizations even throw in like your pen tests with the risk assessments. But purely from the perspective of gaining assurance over controls, this approach has limited value. Now, finally, there are several frameworks or methods available for assurance, but they operate at the individual system level. For example, you have an operating system, and there's a framework that can guide you to gain assurance over the security of the specific operating system. Or let's say you have a database system or a web app or a network device. There are frameworks for each specific device. But the point is these operate at system level. Therefore, they have limited use in the context of overall organizational security assurance, which is comprised of not only just your technologies, but also your processes and your people-based controls, etc. Right? All right, so moving on. So here's a quick visual as to how the compliance-based approach works. So as you can see, you typically start by identifying the type of regulation, industry standard, or the attestation framework that you want to comply with. Now, once that is done, together with your auditors to determine the scope for your compliance, and more often than not, the scope is limited to only a subset of your organization. It could be a business unit or a part of a business unit, and then specific applications, etc. Right? But rarely, if ever, you achieve compliance for the entirety of your organization. Now, once scope is determined, you move on to control testing. Now, this is typically what the auditors call the evidence collection phase. So, essentially, as an organization, you need to provide evidence to your auditors to prove to them that controls related to compliance exist for the specific requirements. Once that step is done, the auditors typically give you a thumbs up, all okay if everything's good, or they'll give you a list of what are called findings or deficiencies, if there's something lacking. And then you go into what's called the remediation phase, where you fix the issues and then have the auditors retest, etc. So that's the typical flow for a compliance-based approach. Now, along similar lines, this is a visual showing how the risk-based approach typically works. So you start by conducting a risk assessment where you identify specific risk scenarios, if you will, evaluate the scenarios, and then assign them ratings, etc. Then you move on to managing the risk by either choosing, to accept the risk, mitigate, transfer, or avoid. But assuming you choose to mitigate the risk, you then identify your controls for implementation, and then go ahead and implement those controls, right? And then you continuously monitor your environment for any emergent risks, any new risks that may be relevant to your environment. And then you also monitor your controls. And then you do this periodically, in a cyclic manner. So that's how that typically works. All right, moving on. So now I want to walk you through the 7-step outcome-based assurance approach that I have developed as part of this dissertation. And the goal here is to provide a, a structured but also flexible process that organizations can follow to gain meaningful assurance over their security controls, not just whether controls exist or to just tick compliance boxes, but whether controls actually achieve the outcomes they're supposed to deliver. So first step is defining objectives. So we start by defining objectives for the assurance initiative. Now this might sound obvious, but it's actually critical because it sets the overall direction and establishes why we're even taking up the assurance project to begin with, right? So here the organization basically asks, what do we want to achieve from a security assurance perspective? Like what level of assurance are we trying to gain, and that sort of sets the direction for the rest of the process, and this also serves as a decision point to determine if the outcome based approach is even appropriate in that context. For example, there may be situations where a compliance driven approach is more suited, like for example, if you have a product that's processing or storing credit card data, then you may be required to comply with PCI DSS. And if you're looking to make sure that your product is compliant with that or your service is compliant with that, then obviously a compliance-based approach that ticks all the boxes for your PCI DSS is obviously more suited than an outcome-based approach, right? But the idea is to sort of provide that flexibility for organizations to decide the objectives for themselves. So, but for organizations that are looking to go beyond compliance and really understand if their controls are providing the intended value, this step sort of lays the groundwork for adopting the outcome-based approach. All right, so moving on. So the next step, step two, is defining the scope, and this is all about figuring out what part of organization this assurance work is going to focus on. So scope could range from a business unit, set of critical processes, an enterprise-wide initiative, or or something along those lines, right? So this step essentially is where the organization gets key stakeholders aligned. So bringing in your executives, risk managers, your engineering and IT leaders, your business unit heads, etc. So everyone agrees on what's included and what's not. And the idea is to keep the project focused and manageable. All right, so moving on, the next step then is selecting the control. So once we know the objectives and the scope, we go into selecting the controls that we're going to evaluate or gain assurance over. Now, the assumption here is that the organization already has a set of controls implemented and it wants to gain assurance over whether those controls are effective. But if it turns out that the organization doesn't have a well organized or well defined list of controls, they can lean on existing frameworks like your NIST 800-53, ISO 27001, etc., as just baselines to figure out what should be there, right? So again, just to avoid confusion, we're not saying the organizations should target compliance with these frameworks. It's just that if the organization doesn't have, like, it doesn't know what controls it has in place, it may have controls in place, but it doesn't know how to characterize how to categorize those, etc. So the idea is to, in such a scenario, the idea is to allow organizations to use an existing framework as a baseline, so they can understand and categorize their controls. But I also emphasize categorizing controls into three broad areas, including technological controls like your firewalls, your EDRs, your IDS, IPS, etc., and process-based controls like your change management, incident response, etc., and then also people-based controls, which ensure employees understand and follow security practices, etc. Right? But the output here is a clear set of controls that are most relevant within the scope that we've defined, so we know exactly what we're going to assess in the next steps. All right, so step four is defining outcomes. Now, this is where the approach really starts to look different from your traditional compliance or risk-based models. And in this step, we explicitly define the outcomes that each control is supposed to achieve. So it's about moving past the questions like, hey, is this control in place? But instead of that, we're asking, what risk does this control actually address, or what is it trying to prevent or detect, and what would happen if the control failed or if it didn't exist at all, things like that, right? So for example, your firewall it's supposed to prevent unauthorized access, right? And similarly, your anti-malware system is supposed to prevent malware attacks, right? It's supposed to provide protection to systems against malware-based attacks, right? And then similarly, change management, the idea, the outcome is supposed to provide is to prevent unauthorized changes, right? So we're trying to, trying each control back to a specific risk scenario, identifying the threats it mitigates or the overall outcome it provides, it's supposed to provide, or the strategy it aligns with, etc. And then the next step is identifying test methods. Now, unlike traditional audits that often rely mostly on positive tests, which is just checking configs or checking if something, if a change is approved, etc. The approach here, it blends positive and negative testing. So positive tests confirm things work as expected, whereas negative tests, try to simulate the ways a control could fail or be bypassed. So here we're going to, confirm the scope and outcomes again, just to make sure we're still on track. Specify success criteria, meaning what exactly does success look like, or acceptable performance look like for each control. And then for each control, identify failure modes, which is basically thinking like an attacker, and thinking about how the control could be bypassed. and then finally deciding on a mix of test methods based on all of the things that we've determined previously. And the tests may include your interviews, document reviews, technical checks, red team exercise, etc., etc. But the idea is to design tests that give strong outcome-oriented evidence of whether a control is effective. All right, moving on. So next step, once the tests are planned out and we execute the test, we evaluate the controls. This involves actually running the tests, collecting evidence, observing results, and then mapping those results against the success criteria that we've defined for ourselves. So we're looking to answer things like, does this control fully achieve its intended outcome, or does it partially achieve it, or does it fail outright? Things like that. And this is the evidence that sort of directly feeds into the final decision-making step, which is the next step. So, in the final step, based on all the testing and evaluation, we make informed decisions about each control. Now, this could mean choosing to retain a control as it is, or enhancing the control, or replacing it with a different solution, or and this is where this approach really differentiates itself from the others is we want to enable people to think about retiring a control if it no longer serves a meaningful purpose, or if its costs outweigh its benefit. So we don't want organizations to have to implement these latest technologies or these rigorous processes if it doesn't make sense for them. So this decision process takes into account not only the technical performance of the control, but factors like your cost, the operational impact it's going to have, and then whether it still aligns with the organization's overall risk landscape, if you will. All right. So that is the 7-step approach that I'm proposing, and I'm calling it outcome-based approach because it shifts the focus from compliance to achieving control outcomes. And I'm hoping to receive feedback on this. The specific 7-step process that I've laid out here. So yeah, that concludes this presentation. Thanks for taking the time to listen. I look forward to receiving your feedback. Also, be sure to read the supplemental document that I've put together. It provides additional details on everything I've discussed as part of this presentation. And I've also shared a draft of my dissertation that I have so far, including the detailed problem description, the literature review that I've conducted, etc. But a fair warning, it's quite a lengthy document, and I don't want to force you to read it entirely. So it's totally optional. But if you could skim through it, I think it'll provide additional context. But yeah, that concludes my presentation. Thanks for listening, and thanks for agreeing to participate in my expert panel. I really appreciate your help. Thank you.